Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, let me say that I'm much more competent in addressing what I have written with regard to this question, more so than what Theodore White has written, which I read some, excuse me, yeah,
Theodore.
Theodore Allen, excuse me, which I read some years ago. And of course, his work speaks for itself. And so I have my own particular take, which I will share with you on the topic at hand. Uh, just to refresh your recollection, what I'm about to say is a summary of what I have written in at least two separate books. One, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, which deals with the 16th century in the context of European settlement in what is now the United States, and to a degree, the areas abutting the United States. And then secondly, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, which deals with the 17th century and to a certain extent then overlaps with what Allen talks about concerning Bacon's Rebellion and what unfolds as European settlement in North America takes flight. So I'll just speak briefly because I take it that it might be more fruitful for you and your comrades to share your thoughts and questions, and we can have a dialogue and discussion. But with regard to the former book, this book deals, as the subtitle suggests, with the roots of white supremacy, or to put it another way, to put it in the contemporary lingo of the United States, or at least a section of the US left. It deals with what I call monetized and militarized identity politics of whiteness. I think that subsequent historians will find it quite curious that at times this term identity politics was oftentimes invoked, but rarely against the original progenitors of this phenomenon, that is to say, the settlers from Europe and their subsets. Matter of fact, in the United States, I've never heard anybody refer to identity politics, to bring it down to the current moment, to apply to Zionism or Israel, for example, although you have a state based upon a specific ethno-religious identity, curiously enough. And that in itself, it seems to me, is worthy of interrogation. But in any event, with regard to the book, as I tell the story, the Catholic powers have a first mover's advantage, so to speak, because after all, they are the ones who sponsor the freebooter Christopher Columbus. But what happens, as you know, is that a few decades after he bumps into the Americas, or at least the Caribbean, you have the secession from the Vatican, spearheaded by Martin Luther, which rather rapidly in historical terms takes root, at least in London. And you're familiar with the Broadway play Six, you're probably familiar with how the story is told about his seeking a divorce and finding it difficult. But of course, part of the story, as I'm sure you know, is seeking to get his grubby little paws on the vast property held by the Catholics in what comes to be called Great Britain. And that leads to Protestantism taking London by storm, which then inaugurates a round robin of religious conflicts. The Protestants, who are the scrappy underdogs, are desperately in need of allies. And though, for example, they had expelled their Jewish community in 1291, they have no or little compunction about seeking an entente with the Jewish diaspora, which, of course, as you know, particularly post 1492, is subjected to the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula. That is to say, this rather horrific process of either converting to Catholicism or be tortured or die. And Therefore, London begins to welcome the Jewish diaspora, as does the country we now refer to as the Netherlands, which does the same thing. Interestingly enough, Fareed Zakaria, the CNN spokesman or journalist, quote unquote, has a new book out pretentiously called The Age of Revolutions, where he points to the Netherlands as sort of the seedbed of so-called liberal democracy. And of course, part of his alleged evidence is the fact that the Protestant Holland invited in the Jewish diaspora. Now, of course, they were in the same position as London. That is to say, they needed allies against the rampages of the so-called Catholic powers. And certainly, as they began to challenge the Iberians for domination in this movable feast of colonialism, which was breaking out like a bad virus in the 1500s, they needed as many warm bodies as they could muster, particularly to confront the streperous indigenous population soon to be joined by the enslaved Africans. Interestingly enough, if you look at the history of Cuba, for example, you see that the Catholic powers in that island, they had a different approach than the Protestant powers. That is to say, that you had Black conquistadors in Cuba, along with Black enslaved, for example, not only in Cuba, but a good deal of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, whereby the Protestant powers, and then of course, in the Spanish Empire, of course, you have the simultaneously export of the Inquisition to the Americas. That is to say, persecution of the Jewish population, as I show and suggest in my book, in what we now call New Mexico. You had so-called conversos or new Christians. Some use what might be called an insulting term, such as crypto Jews, who were in on the ground floor with regard to settlement in New Mexico, as the Spanish were invading that particular land. And so what you see are basically different paths towards colonialism. And I'm afraid to say that in the Anglosphere in particular, although they were welcoming to a degree, at least comparison to the Iberians, the Jewish diaspora, they were much more regressive or much more advanced, depending on your point of view, with regard to forging this new identity politics, that is to say, of whiteness, which as a accompaniment was delivered by further degradation of the Black population. Fewer, if any, Black conquistadors under what comes to be called the Union Jack. And so this is a dilemma we're still grappling with. And what's interesting is that just to also bring it up to date, just a few days ago, there was a letter in the Washington Post from a Jewish studies scholar at Indiana University in Bloomington. You can perhaps look it up as we speak. And she was reprimanding the Zionist columnist Ruth Marcus, who had just taken a junket to Israel. And of course, her frame with regard to Israel was that period from the Inquisition in the 1400s, perhaps before, to the Holocaust, 1945. And this Jewish studies scholar was saying, well, yes, with regard to Europe, that's an appropriate frame, but is an appropriate frame for the Jewish population stretching from Morocco through Egypt. Chaim Saban, who of course is a major funder of the Democratic Party in Hollywood, is of Egyptian Jewish descent. all the way to Iran. And she could have said, is that an appropriate frame to apply to the Jewish American population, which to a degree has had a certain kind of induction into the hallowed halls of whiteness, because as noted, the settlers needed as many warm bodies as they can muster to subjugate the indigenous population and keep the enslaved Africans in line. And of course, there are bumps along the road with regard, to the Leo Frank case more than a century ago in Georgia, for example, the spiraling anti-Jewish fervor of today, which we can go into. But the Indiana University scholar had a point with regard to how this question of the Jewish diaspora is framed in the context of whiteness and white supremacy. In any case, in the second book that I mentioned, I talk about other signposts along the road. And this is where my work perhaps intersects with Theodore Allen's work with regard to Bacon's Rebellion, which, of course, I do not see. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with Bacon's Rebellion in the century before 1776, these revolts against the elites. I tend to see it as a kind of right-wing populism. And just like right-wing populism today has been able to co-opt some, to use the current term, melanated people, the same was true in 1676 Virginia, for example, because they were basically interested in ousting the Native Americans from their land, just like there was an issue in 1776 as well, which Ned Blackhawk points out quite well in his recent book, The Rediscovery of America, which interestingly enough won a book prize just a month or so ago. And of course, in that book, I also deal with the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which I see as a precursor to 1776, insofar as, amongst other things, as William Pettigrew points out in his UNC Press book of a few years past, that 1688 involved in no small measure the deregulation of the African slave trade. That is to say, to that point, the Royal African Company had been under the thumb of the monarch. With 1688, it's deregulated, allowing in merchants of various stripes and hues, who then begin to descend upon Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic, which inevitably leads to slave revolts, inevitably leads to second thoughts in London with regard to the efficacy of the slave trade and slavery itself. Of course, you could say the same thing for the Netherlands. The scholar Marjolein Kars has a very useful book on a revolt in Suriname that's a precursor to the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which of course is the real turning point with regard to abolition. And unfortunately, I'm afraid to say that many of our fellow radicals have not paid sufficient attention to this revolt of the unpaid sector of the working class that seized power, and have paid undue attention to the alleged and purported progressive elements of 1776, even though the creation of the United States led to an exponential rise in the number of enslaved in the Americas, and in the United States in particular, led to the United States ousting the Spanish from leadership and captaining of the African slave trade to Cuba as early as the 1790s. There was an article in the William and Mary Quarterly just a few months ago by Alex Baruchi of UC Irvine that talked about as early as the 1790s, 1800s, US nationals were captaining the slave trade to the Rio de la Plata, current day Argentina, of all places. I wrote a book, The Deepest South, talking about the vanguard role of US nationals in dragging Africans across the Atlantic to Brazil. Of course, the Washington Post, their journalist Terrence McCoy, you can look that article up as well, did a piece on this subject where I'm referred to that just came out a week or two ago. And so in sum, one of the topics that I deal with in these two books, perhaps three or four, to be blunt, is how the Anglosphere was able to overcome the first movers advantage of the Iberians. And then, of course, we know that in 1898, deliver a knockout blow to the tottering Spanish Empire, sweeping up many of its erstwhile colonies, including Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, etc. And then extending its hegemony into the 21st century, although, once again, to cite what's going on at this very moment, it's possible that we're in the midst of a Copernican change in the global correlation of forces involving the decline of the Group of Seven, the United States, its Western European allies, and Japan, the ascendancy of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, joined by Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, perhaps joined later this year by Algeria, Indonesia, perhaps Mexico. And this will lead to conclude to what we've seen in the last few days. That is to say, tactical victories for the US and its allies. For example, April 1st, the killing of Iranian leaders in Damascus in violation of international law. But then April 13th, when Israeli defenses are exposed and with these launching of projectiles into Israel, and tactical victories and strategic defeats may be the theme going forward in this decade for the imperialist camp, which in a sense is good news, except that for the strugglers in the United States of America, the jury is still out whether or not that's in fact good news, or whether or not it'll be a precursor to an intensified class collaboration, which lies at the heart of settler colonialism, which has not been sufficiently recognized, and of course lies at the heart of this militarized and monetized identity politics known as whiteness. It's too soon to tell whether or not this changing correlation of forces globally will be good news for strugglers here. And although I have to say I'm heartened not only by the protests erupting at Columbia University and the streets of the San Francisco Bay Area, at University of Southern California campus, the protests over the canceling of a commencement speaker, because not least it's helping to expose the hypocrisy and double standards of contemporary imperialism. You know, they invent this term cancel culture and get people on the left to sign on to it, when actually they were just objecting to canceling of right-wing people. It's par for the course to cancel left-wing people, or people who go against the imperialist status quo, as the commencement speaker or the erstwhile commencement speaker at USC could tell you, or the so-called rules-based international order, which leads to no condemnation of Israel for violating international conventions by bombing a diplomatic legation on April 1st, but tighten sanctions against Iran for responding. So hopefully these sorts of contradictions will help to enhance the consciousness of strugglers in the United States, helping us to evade the logic of capitalism and imperialism based on class collaboration, which ultimately can redound into fascism. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Dr. Horne. We definitely appreciated it. So I'll start off the conversation, and I'm sure it's going to just go ebb and flow with the interest of everyone, because I know a few people probably have questions prepared. But The idea of class collaboration. We've seen in America how white privilege and how whites on a certain level have actually benefited from the white privilege. But at the same time, I see that there's no universal health care, education's become expensive, the environment's getting destroyed, the shrinking of the middle class. And I'm wondering, are whites, the majority of whites, really benefiting from this collaboration that's been going on since I guess my ancestors have come to this part of the world?
Well, I'm sure you know the answer to that, which is that historically, there are those who have argued that when, for example, the indigenous were chased off their land in what is now the southeast quadrant of North America, the Cherokees, for example, and forced to embark on what is called the Trail of Tears, and that you had Europeans fresh off the boat, able to move into what were oftentimes mansions that the Cherokees had constructed. It would be difficult to say that those particular beneficiaries of genocidal policies did not benefit. But as you look at the meth epidemic, the fentanyl epidemic, as you look at current West Virginia, as you look at many rural areas of the United States as we speak, it's difficult to say that those who are voting for Trump are benefiting. Now, of course, 2 points. One, many of our friends on the left, you would think that of the 75 million who voted for Trump, they're all lawyers and accountants and doctors and businessmen. And there was a debate in certain circles about this book, Thomas Schaller and Paul Waldman, White Rural Rage, I think it's called, and whether or not they are doing a disservice to Trump or purported Trump voters in rural areas, although they raise the interesting question, which I'm sure has occurred to yourself, which is, where's the Black rural rage? It's not like, Black people were doing well. Why aren't they voting for Trump? Although, of course, we're told, and we shall see in a few months, that the voting patterns for many Black Americans are shifting, although that may be a decision to try to cut a deal. If fascism is coming, people are going to try to cut deals, just like you had certain Jewish folks who decided to enlist in the Nazi army, for example. People are trying to cut deals, although Paula Shropshire of Black Pact has said that the samples for these polls that are showing Black support for Trump are too small to come to adequate conclusions. In any case, we'll see. But in any case, we know that the proportions are not the same. And so so that raises questions about the descendants of the settlers and their voting patterns in the face of immiseration, for example, which should lead not to an attempt to rationalize that or cover it up, but to explain it, which by and large is absent. I was just on another program where I pointed out that I'm happy to see the mass protests in Columbia University, the streets of California, et cetera. But I think our intellectuals have not necessarily done their job in terms of theorizing this present moment, just like this term identity politics. I mean, where did that come from? And why isn't it applied to Zionism, for example, as I mentioned a moment or two ago? That's part of the ideological weaknesses of the US left writ large. And of course, we could ascribe this in part to the devastation of the Red Scare. But then again, if you look at the Red Scare, which is how I got involved in academia in the first place, researching and writing that, you have to ask the question, well, why was there so much support amongst settlers for anti-communism? Even on the left. I mean, this gray hair I have on my head, it's not a dye job. And so I was around when many of our friends on the left were acting as cheerleaders for the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of solidarity in Poland, with President Duda just meeting of Trump in Trump Tower just a day or two ago, talking once again, I'm sure, about Fort Trump established in Poland. I mean, I see a hand, so perhaps we should go to it.
Yeah, go ahead, RJ, excuse
Thank,
me.
thank you so much. Dr. Horne, you said fascism is coming and so people will cut deals. What do you think fascism in the United States is going to look like?
Huh. Well, unfortunately, I did not bring my crystal ball with me, but you know, I'm sure that I wrote a book a year or two ago called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of US Fascism. And in that book, I talk about class collaboration and how, for example, in Texas, for example, which has the unfortunate title of perhaps being the zenith of genocide and liquidation of the indigenous population, it was the federal government that was saying, put the indigenous on reservations, send them all to Oklahoma, which was supposed to be a Bantustan on Texas' northern border. As noted, the Cherokees were evacuated there, so to speak. But from the grassroots, bubbling up from the grassroots was this idea, no, they need to be liquidated. And of course, that's what wound up happening. And so I'm also curious, anybody read this novel by Philip Roth, The Plot Against America? Raise your hand. So it's a novel about the coming of fascism to Newark in the 1940s. And of course, you know, rather typically, to cite the letter writer in the Washington Post from Indiana University, the frame is Europe. It's not North America, where you've had genocidal crushing of indigenous resistance, mass enslavement of Africans. It's mostly about how Jewish people, as if Newark were Dresden in 1935 or 1943, were going to be the ultimate victims. But to elaborate on this point, I think we'll see more of what we witness already in this land. That is to say, disproportionate exercise of the death penalty and police terror, not least against the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class, who had the gumption to deprive elites of billions of dollars in enslaved property by 1865 without compensation. You will most likely see, if the Supreme Court has its way, you might have seen the case that they were debating the other day of whether or not Mr. Trump, to continue this chilling hypothetical, can order Navy SEALs to execute his political opponents. That's an issue that's now on the table in the United States of America, for example. So, you know, I'm sort of unwilling to speculate about what's around the corner, particularly when we know that it will be dire and dastardly and diabolical, given the bloody history of this country, which somehow has not necessarily been interpreted in that fashion.
Thanks. Joy, would you like to ask a question? Thanks, Dr. Horne.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Horne. I really appreciate Marlo inviting me to that. When I was listening to you talking about the thing happening in Israel and the way that Israel bombed the embassy, etc., you seem to suggest that it might be, on the one hand, good for the West to win this side of things, and on the other hand, it creates still the problem we have here in terms of whiteness and colonialism, etc. And I'm wondering if that's that dichotomy, do you see a solution or a way that we could move forward if that was something that you were implying? Because I was a little like, well, why would it be good if we won?
No, no, no. What I was saying was that when I interpret as the impending eclipse of the imperialist camp is being perceived abroad. That's the import of the new regime in Niger after ousting the French, asking US to evacuate from its drone base. That's the import of a number of African countries being co-opted into the BRICS led by South Africa. That's the import of then the United States trying to gain leverage against South Africa by improving relations with Angola and Zimbabwe. This is all defense calling in. They impose pulverizing sanctions on Zimbabwe a few decades ago because of land reform. So what I was trying to suggest that the dichotomy might be that the eclipse of the imperialist camp is, generally speaking, sound anti-imperialist news, particularly for those in the so-called global South. But I was also suggesting that it's unclear to me, at least, whether it'll have the same impact domestically in light of what I perceive to be as ideological and organizational weaknesses, or what I perceive to be rampant and under-theorized class collaboration, etc. That's what I meant by that dichotomy.
Okay. Thank you. I was that helps quite a bit. So the actions that we need to take here would be more about strengthening our own, I guess, politics, left side of class thing. The other thing you mentioned was the whole, my question has to do with Christian nationalism and communism. It seems to me that the fear of communism comes in part out of that same sort of Christian nationalist thing because of the sort of Christian order that they brought here from Europe, and this whole idea of like that everybody has a place that they're supposed to be, and sort of like there were the slaves, and then there were everyday people, and then the masters. There was this whole, I was doing some research on this idea of, the role, there's a book, The Role of Masters, and how they're supposed to, they get the spoils, and then everybody else is sort of like, they're just supposed to fall in line. Very much coming back, sort of an idea of the feudal system and the manor system in Europe, which then transferred sort of to the plantation systems here. And that idea of communism, what was happening in France, terrified them because it was breaking up the feudal system. And they didn't want that transferring to the US. And that was the beginning of sort of this fear of communism that has sort of carried forth throughout American history.
A pause, so I'll interject. Surprise, surprise. Needless to say, I prefer my own analysis, which is that anti-communism in the United States is grounded in no small measure by the reality that in 1865, the most significant investment on these shores was expropriated without compensation, one of the largest uncompensated expropriations of private property before 1917, and that fuels a certain kind of anti-communism because socialism is thought to involve similarly the uncompensated expropriation of private property. In the United States, this gains velocity, not least because one of the exemplars of the advocacy of socialism happened to be a person like Paul Robeson, tallest tree in our forest, intellectual, Hollywood star, professional athlete, etc. And in his person, you see the confluence of anti-Blackness and anti-communism, which have tended to go hand in hand. Now, with regard to Christian nationalism, in a number of remarks that you can find online that I've given in all these interviews I've been given in the last months, if not years, I've mentioned some rather troubling developments on that score. For example, Congressman Dan Crenshaw of the state of Texas, you may be familiar with him. He's the guy with the eye patch. Republican in good standing. He's rebuked Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, because Carlson has been saying that the Israelis are repressing and oppressing Christian brethren in that part of the world. You see that the Black woman conservative flamethrower, Candace Owens, in her split with Ben Shapiro, a card-carrying member of the Zionist lobby, has played the Christian card against Mr. Shapiro, who is Jewish. Given what I've written about and have articulated in the past 30 minutes or so about the confluence of religion and the construction of race, and given that these right-wing trends involve great leaps backwards, we should not be surprised that this earlier era of tensions, religious tensions, Protestants versus Catholics, Christian versus Jewish, Muslim versus Christian, that they may begin to reassert themselves. As I said, I think I said this in my 16th century book. So at one time, you had these people in what is now Great Britain in the 1500s burning each other at the stake. By the 1800s, or the late 1800s, you had them joining hands, Protestants and Catholics, that is, and burning Black people at the stakes. So there is a certain kind of devolution, if you like, that we should pay close and careful attention to.
Thanks, Dr. Horne. Go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm just, communism doesn't really become a significant factor in U.S. political thought until after the Commune in 1871. So, I think I don't know, what's your view of that? I mean, if you're going to say that communism is already, anti-communism is already in 1865, sort of rearing its head.
Well, that's not exactly what I said, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Correct me. I'm happy to be corrected. I'm just trying to put
I
together
talked about uncompensated expropriation of private property.
Yeah.
And how that was thought in 1865 and how that was thought to be the essence of socialism.
Later,
yeah. As you know, Karl Marx was writing for the New York Herald Tribune in the 1860s that you had the alleged specter of communism with the Communist Manifesto well before the 1860s. You had revolts of the unpaid sector of the working class being successful as early as 1804 with massive capital loss and dynamic and profound impact on the correlation of forces. So I think that we should not try to build, pardon the expression, a Berlin Wall between the struggles of the 19th century and the struggles of the 20th century, but instead see a sort of fluidity, a sort of continuum, not a snapshot, but a film dissolve, as one scene dissolves into another scene.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
I was going to say, it does not end in 1989 or 1991. And it does not necessarily begin in 1917.
Right. I was going to say that, though, I was fumbling along, and um, we might also see, and I tend to think of the nullification crisis in 1832 as part of that sequence of dissolving scene changes, and fundamental, as fundamental as and you know, it's part and parcel of what became the arguments, the pro-South, arguments in the Civil War period. And I was going to say that after the 1870s, because you have the massive crisis, I think that starts in 1873, that ends up being responsible to a large extent for the ending of Reconstruction. You really have this, like in your nice metaphor, this sequence of dissolves that are part and parcel of what grows into full-blown anti-communist, definitely by the 1870s. Anyway, my thoughts, my 2 cents about it. So,
as I point out in my Texas book, during the time of the Paris Commune, for example, Jefferson Davis, the erstwhile leader of the so-called Confederate States of America, was in correspondence with his comrades with regard to the events in the streets, for example. You can find the sources on page 175, 176 of my Texas book.
Thanks. Sean, you have a question? Thanks, Dr. Horne.
Oh,
There-
yes. Yes, I wanted to ask you, I have these conversations with some of my older comrades because I'm old too, even though my hair's not totally gray. I'm pretty old too. And I get into these arguments because you've been speaking about fascism and its potential, presence in the United States. And you might be familiar with, I'm sure you are, the United Front Against Fascism that was raised up in the earlier years in the 19th century. And some people are saying, well, Trump and the MAGA movement is a fascist movement that requires the application of this old approach of United Front Against Fascism. And that means I get at these arguments. They say that means that you got to go with Biden, and anything else is just a diversion away from the United Front Against Fascism. What is your thoughts about this? You've probably heard it, but I'd be curious to hear what you think about this.
Well, I think the U.S. left is long past time to take advantage of the intricacies and peculiarities of presidential elections. I mean, you would think, you have a lot of talk about the Electoral College, but they don't realize, apparently, that given U.S. presidential elections, you can get the most votes and still lose, as Hillary Clinton and Al Gore could well attest. That U.S. presidential elections are actually 50 plus separate and different elections, just like if you had an electoral college in France, you have different, electoral college in the European Union. The conditions in France and the history of France do not necessarily mirror the situation in Hungary, for example. I'm in the state of Texas. The Republican Party has a stranglehold on the state of Texas, has had it for decades now, every top office. In my neighborhood, just days ago, returning to my theme of religious tensions, you had Nazis marching. This is recently, under the banner of down with Jewish supremacy. So in the state of Texas, to say that folks have to vote for Biden, otherwise they're contributing to Trump's victory, well, Trump is going to win Texas. I'm not sure how to break that to you. And so obviously we need to be exploring alternatives that might help to break the stranglehold of Trumpism in Texas. As Karl Rove pointed out in the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago, there are about 7 states that are in play with regard to U.S. presidential elections. Now there, this Biden or bust strategy might be appropriate, but seeking some sort of homogeneity, I guess the idea is it's very important to have everybody on the same page. Even Texas on the same, it's just like the new Civil War movie, which was #1 at the box office, with the premise being Texas and California are in revolt against the White House. They're on the same page, and everybody knows that California, probably second to Hawaii, as being the bluest of the blue states, and Texas is the reddest of the red states. So I guess the screenwriter, at least implicitly, feels that we all need to be on the same page. And so we all need to vote the same. But I'm not sure if that's taking into account the machinations of the Electoral College, the work, the individual peculiarities of different voting jurisdictions, et cetera. But at the same time, I don't consider myself a dogmatist on this issue because the stakes are so high and the situation is so dire. I think it's important to suggest that reasonable people can disagree with me with regard to what I've just laid out and still maintain your membership in the progressive movement.
Thanks, Dr. Horne. Steve, go ahead.
Is he talking?
We can't hear you, Steve. You're still on mute. Steve, you're still on mute.
Are you asking me if I have a question?
No. Steve Smith.
Okay, I'm here. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Go ahead, Steve.
So yeah, thank you, Dr. Horne, for your presentation. Very interesting, very insightful. So I have a question, and I want to bring the topic to where we are today and where we're going. So you mentioned earlier the collective West, or the G7, I think you mentioned, and then you also mentioned BRICS, right? So we find ourselves at a situation now where there's this battle sort of between this sort of unipolar world, or is it going to be moving more towards a multipolar world? And obviously the collective West, led by the United States, and I call it the EU and NATO, right? So all of that really makes up the collective West. And then you have BRICS, right? So first question I have is, as you talk about the confluence of religion and the construction of race, what role is race playing as we look at the collective West and their desperation to maintain their power and control, their dominance over the world? I even heard you mentioned Tucker Carlson when he interviewed Putin a couple of months ago. Putin made a comment that the collective West, they want domination at all costs. Now, as the EU continues to expand, NATO continues to expand, what role is race playing in that is my first question. And how is the construction of race as we understand it today changing as we see this whole thing evolve? That's my first question.
Well, I'll respond, but if you want to follow up to ask for more specificity, please do, because the short answer, obviously, is that the construction of race has quite a bit to do with how the situation is unfolding. You would be correct to think that apartheid still lurks in the international community if you see the distinction, as I noted, between how Israel was treated with regard to its depredations of April 1st with no condemnation, and how Iran is being treated with regard to April 13th, for example. If you look at the United States, well, hold on for a second. I have these pigeons that always come to my balcony.
They're the BRICS. They want to be let in.
There you go.
Sorry, what you say?
I said they were the BRIC nations. They want to be let in.
Oh, no. No, these pigeons, they're unwanted tenants who crap on my balcony and then fly away, leading me to clean up the mess. I mean, it's like a metaphor for imperialism, for example.
There you go.
But in any case, obviously the rise of China, it's ironic indeed that the imperialists thought that they had executed a masterstroke in 1972 with Nixon's trip to China and the anti-Soviet entente leading to massive foreign direct investment in China, now creating this juggernaut, now leading to an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs from the Council on Foreign Relations, where Mr. Matt Pottinger, a former advisor to Trump, touted as the Secretary of State in 2025. Trump wins, and Mike Gallagher, recently departing Congress, calling for the overthrow of the Communist Party of China. And part of their rationale is that there is undue and incessant squabbling between various members of the ruling class on questions like Ukraine, for example. Bubbling to the surface are similar conflicts with regard to West Asia, Israel. But they say that the anti-China ethos unites all factors of all factions of the ruling class. And I might say a goodly number of non-US ruling class folk, because given the stakes at hand with the rise of this non-European state and Asian state, we're all familiar with anti-Asian racism, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, for example, rather unique in the xenophobic history of US immigration, for example. When Ho Li, the scientist of Chinese ancestry, how he was maltreated during the Clinton administration, the cross-examination of the leader of TikTok, who kept telling the member of Congress, hey man, I'm Singaporean. They said, I want to know if you're Chinese. And so given the fact that by some measures, you can only measure the rise of what you call the collective West since 1750, or at least since the century of humiliation in China from 1840-41 with the seizing of Hong Kong to 1949, it would be naive to think that race and racism are absent from the current conjuncture. And certainly, if you focus on the United States of America and look at the anti-immigrant ethos and how people from south of the border are being maltreated as we speak, if you look at the aforementioned occupants of death row, the disproportionate victims of police terror domestically, it would be naive to think that racism was absent and that might have the ability to accelerate given the decline of the US role in the global community and the fact that it will be much more difficult to exert their will abroad, as examples of Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and other sites too numerous to mention tend to suggest. Whereas at home, given the pre-existing white supremacy, class collaboration, anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant ethos, it might be easier to take it out of our hides, I'm afraid to say. But of course, if I did not respond, feel free to follow
up. Hey, Steve, if you could hold on for a bit. I wanted everyone to know, Danny Shaw, he was a professor in the CUNY system. He's over at Columbia right now. Danny, do you want to give us an update on what's going on with the protest? I know you just said Norman Finkelstein was just speaking.
Yeah, thanks, Brother Cole and Gerald. Thanks so much. The encampment's going strong, despite the NYPD riot police clearing it out yesterday. The students have returned. Myself and some other professors from John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the city of New York have also been fired. Myself, after 2 decades teaching Latin American and Caribbean studies at CUNY. So we're here in solidarity. An attack on one is an attack on all. Norman Finkelstein finished up a few minutes ago, and then we heard from a delegation from the 1968 occupation of Colombia. I don't go back to 1968. I do go back to the 1990s when we had our own sit-ins, protests, and occupations here. So thanks so much to Gerald and Cole. It would only be better if we were all here on 116th Street taking over Columbia doing this in person. But I can only stay for a few minutes, but I just wanted to be present here for this important dialogue and talk.
Thanks, Danny. Steve, did you have a follow-up question for Dr. Horne?
Well, no, not right now. I'll let David get his question in, maybe if we have some time afterwards.
Okay, go ahead, David.
Oh, thank you very much for coming, Professor Horne. You mentioned Norman Finkelstein. I watched a talk with him earlier, and it's part of the thing he addressed was Germany's blind support, really unquestioning support for Israel, going so far as to call it part of its raison d'etre. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And you know, in full view of another genocide. And then I also have to think about Germany's hardly any pocket change for what happened in Namibia to the Herero and Nami people, and comparing and contrasting that. And even in the case of Haiti, Haiti is in a condition because they had to pay reparations in the wrong direction to France. And I also, you know, am thinking about here in this country, the utility, how realistic the call for reparations are here. And full disclosure, I am on the membership rolls of an organization called the ADOS Advocacy Foundation, something that I'm having increasingly conflicted feelings about for reasons that I'll maybe, I don't have enough time to go into. So really, if you could speak to that, particularly in the call for reparations in this country, how Germany is supporting Israel as opposed to Namibia, and just the whole threat of reparations. And in this country, the call for reparations will be specifically in this controversy about that exclusively and specifically for American descent. You know, people who can trace their ancestry directly back, you know, like myself, to, in my case, Littleton, North Carolina, as opposed to just giving it to Black people in general in this country. Thank you, sir.
Well, let me first of all say that the German case represents, in a perverse way, some of the good news, because as you probably know, Nicaragua has dragged Germany before the International Court of Justice because of its depredations in support of Israel, supplying of weapons, number two, to the United States of America. That represents this change correlation of forces that I was making reference to, whereby the so-called global South are now putting what one of your comrades called the collective West in the dock, so to speak. With regard to ADOS, I think that they have a point. And as a matter of fact, I make this point in my 1776 book, which came out in 2014, a decade ago, which is that in the United States of America, there is a rather peculiar and pointed persecution and oppression of descendants of mainland enslaved Africans, which is not to suggest that other Black people escape persecution. It's just like when I go to London, where I'll be within weeks, I tend to believe that I get a better reception than perhaps even Black Britishers, perhaps certainly than Jamaicans and Nigerians, for example. And this makes sense because the folks on the mainland, we're the people who've been going toe-to-toe with these settlers for centuries. But at the same time, with regard to a struggle for reparations in a right-wing country like the United States of America, or at least right-wing settlerdom, you need all the allies you can get if you're really serious about this struggle. And certainly if you look at reparations, we see that the Caribbean nations are in many ways in advance, understandably, of people in the United States because they have sovereignty. They have votes to trade in multilateral organizations, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, et cetera. So they have more leverage. They have more bargaining power. And so to turn our backs on their compatriots here in North America, I don't think is wise tactically or politically. At the same time, let me point you to recent unfortunate comments by the actor David Oyelowo. You may recall he played Martin Luther King in Selma. He was just in that movie playing Bass Reeves, the black sheriff on the Old West, for example. He represents an attitude that gives fuel to ADOS claims, because he's saying, well, you know, he's Black British, Nigerian ancestry. He was saying, well, you know, the reason I do so well in the United States is because when I come here, I don't get involved in all these contradictions, you know, and all the, you know, these Negro questions, et cetera. And of course, he has a plummy British accent, of course. And that's part of the problem, you see, because it would be as if I go to London and I say, oh, you know, I don't get involved in all this stuff because people in British, they're treating me okay, so why should I be objecting? You know, so it's a complicated question, and thank you for your response.
Anyone else have any questions? Dr. Horne, I wanted to follow up by saying that, you know, I've been with this group on and off since 2007. And just from reading the readings that we've done, what I've seen is that you've seen a group of people, Europeans, particularly the British. They fought the Spanish, they fought the French, they fought the indigenous people here. They co-opted, you know, the laborers, and then they brought in free labor. And so when I think about 500 years later, they basically have been doing the same thing, just expanding, taking over the Western Hemisphere. And now we see them in Europe, sort of marginalizing Western Europe, their allies. And in every piece of state doctrine, they talk about their hegemony, their desire to take over the world. They spend 3 to 1 more than China. While I understand that the BRICS, I understand is sort of, I wonder if it's an invention of the ruling class from the standpoint that I understand it was first coined by Goldman Sachs. And not to say that there isn't some political weight behind the BRICS, but I guess what I'm saying is that I wouldn't count the ruling class of America or the ruling class that's in power right now, not to continue their onslaught, meaning that they can probably take China, you know, and at the same time go against the West. And I feel like it's really going to be the people of color, the people in the ground, that are going to be the game changers in this equation. And I wanted to sort of say, if you can come back to that. And I guess one example would be the more fires we can ignite, for example, like what's going on in Haiti and what's going on in Nigeria, that's going to go a long way to helping us sort of break up or slow down their desire for world domination. And I wanted to get your input on that.
Well, it's interesting. Some of my lengthening list of critics have accused me of campism, for example. Although I don't think that they're only criticizing me. If you go back and look at the history of Black people in the United States, because of class collaboration, we've oftentimes had to make alliances beyond the North Atlantic camp. That's the import of our solidarity with the Haitian Revolution. I wrote an entire book about our solidarity with Mexico. The thread of my Texas book is solidarity with Native American nations, solidarity with the socialist camp. And so when folks on the left accuse Black people of campism, I guess they're saying we should be subjected to the none too tender mercies of these settlers and just take it without seeking foreign alliances, even though when US imperialism gets into hot water, they have no compunction about seeking allies abroad, be it NATO, being aligned with the Soviet Union in 1941. I mean, sometimes I wonder, are these people on the left, or are they ignorant, or they're just playing ignorant? Second of all, with regard to BRICS, yes, originally the coinage came from a Goldman Sachs partner. So let's set that aside. But if you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, the counterpoint to NATO, that did not come from Goldman Sachs. That's the military expression, if you like, of the counterpoint to NATO. That comes organically from Russia and China itself, for example. And with regard to what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in Niger, of course, that's exceedingly important. All of what's happening in Colombia is important. I think that's why we had the interruption to take a on the ground report. What's happening in the San Francisco Bay Area is important. I mean, there are many fronts in this struggle. It's a long struggle. And of course, we cannot rule out the possibility that the imperialists will come from behind. Maybe they will be able to overthrow the Communist Party of China, which of course would be a great leap backwards. All I'm talking about are current trends and where the trends seem to be heading. Trends seem to be heading in the proper direction. In 1979, with the Nicaraguan Revolution, for example, with the Grenadian Revolution, for example. But by 1989, things did not seem to be heading in the right direction. So history is strange that way.
Great, thanks. Russell, any questions? Shelley, go ahead, Shelley.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Professor Horne, for being here. And my question has specifically to do with Haiti and the coverage, the media coverage on Haiti and what's going on the ground, the US and France's and Canada's interest in Haiti, and using Kenya as a sort of conduit in order to get into Haiti and to bring civil order into the country. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a very complex and unsettled situation, as you well know. The latest news is that the Caribbean community, which in this particular instance seems to be spearheaded by Barbados, has worked out, in their estimation, a kind of a transitional regime for Haiti. Many are suspicious because CARICOM seems to be working with the core group, US, France, and Canada, which is looked at askance, to put it mildly. My own suggestion, although it doesn't seem to have much chance of being attained, but that should not deter us from proposing it, is that we somehow find a way to involve the Cubans in this negotiation process. And since they are a major player in the social welfare sector of Haiti with regard to the dispensing of healthcare, for example, with regard to educating Haitian youth, for example, given the long-term relationship between these two territories, for example. It would be a blow against the blockade, for example. It would be a thumb in the eye of US imperialism, for example, which is one of the reasons why, as of today, it does not seem to be possible to accomplish that particular goal. But I think, as I've indicated before, that all of us who sell our labor for a wage owe a debt of gratitude to Haiti. The successful revolt of the unpaid sector of the working class, setting a model for the Americas as a whole, including the United States of America. It's no accident, as the historians like to say, that after the abolition of slavery, you have a great leap forward for unions of working people in the United States, in particular, the struggle for the 8-hour day, for example. So I think that it's incumbent upon us all to take an interest in Haiti, to be in solidarity with Haiti, to follow what's going on in Haiti and to object. For example, when the Biden team, as they've just done, have sent a number of Haitian residents in the United States back to the island to an uncertain fate.
Thanks. Shelley, do you have a follow-up question?
I was also curious about the media coverage on Haiti and what your thoughts on that? Are they accurately being portrayed in the media, in the U.S. media?
Well, it depends on what U.S. media you're talking about. I mean, oh, by the way, which allows me to say that I do interviews on KPFK, the Pacific station in Los Angeles, 11 a.m. Pacific on Saturdays.
Oh, that's great.
Sorry?
No, that's great. We're going to note that. That's good to know. I want to make sure I get that in on my calendar.
We have lots of Haitian content on this program. If I'm not mistaken, we'll have a Haitian segment tomorrow, in fact. So once again, it depends on what segment of the media you're referring to. I've been on Democracy Now! Talking about Haiti I wrote a book on Haiti, Confronting Black Jacobins, a sort of follow-on to C.L.R. James' book, The Black Jacobins. Now, of course, if you're talking about the bourgeois press, there are many objections that one can make with regard to the portrayal of Haiti. And of course, this is no accident. You might have seen the article in The Intercept just the other day with the New York Times style guidelines or supplies to its reporters, where they suggested the reporters avoid the very deployment of the term Palestine in their reportage, for example, not to mention genocide and ethnic cleansing. So I read the bourgeois press, and I think that those of us who are in the trenches should do so, not necessarily to get the truth of the matter asserted, but to understand the state of mind against those with whom we are in combat. And it should not be a shock nor a surprise that the reportage in Haiti, like the reportage on, dare I say, Palestine, is not up to par.
Effie, I wanted to, Gerald, Dr. Horne, I wanted Effie to show you her website. She's done some work in documenting the slave revolts, and I wanted to get your comments about it. I'm thinking that, the work that she's put in and you being able to see it, you may be a useful source of information for you in some of your upcoming research. Effie, can you pull up your screen? I think you have access to your screen.
I think that's the other way around. Thank you, Dr. Horne. Share. Let me move this little thing. I just wanted to show you the map because I really loved your book, Counter-Revolution. It was mesmerizing. And I cited you. These are all revolts by Africans and African descendants from roughly, I started around 1500. I just go up to 1500 and I'm going up to about 1922. And each one that you open has some video. They all have an image. And I was telling the group that I think images are very important, the way they work on the mind. And a short description. And then I have citations. And I have cited you a number of times in Jamaica, Haiti, Louisiana, 3 times in Jamaica. And is Jamaica. Is this more?
Effie, I don't know if you know it, but you have one of the drop downs is sort of covering that part of your screen.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can close this a little bit. can't close it.
Okay.
In, let me see, 1795, let me show you one. There's so many in 1795.
Right. Blame Haiti. Blame Saint-Domingue.
It was a hot year. What can I tell you?
So you're implying the influence of the Haitian Revolution influenced revolts all over the world.
Oh yeah.
Of course.
Oh yes. That was major. That was major. That's when most of them, of course, took place. It was kind of like what they call a contagion effect. But I mean, there were many revolts before, as you could see what color is before 1700s. All the black ones are like before 1700s. So there were quite a few before, and then of course, really after 1800s, it's going to really take off all the way up until the abolition of enslavement. And then Dr. Horne, I have ship revolts. I told the group I used If We Must Die as my basis. So he has 400 revolts. From there, I took 100, which I called successful because they killed the crew or they got away. And then from there, I went down to 58, where I could give a good summation of what happened on that particular ship. So, but I'm very inspired by your work. Like I said, I used your work heavily, still using it. And now I'm working on 1930 to 1994. I'm doing a second map. And I was really focusing on the 60s, but even before the 60s, I'm finding that the 1930s is really a big turning point. So I'm going to do the same thing in terms of mapping those revolts. But I just want to let you know I use you heavily, and I really appreciate your scholarship. And I will continue to use you. Thank you.
Thanks, Effie.
Thanks, Dave.
Isn't the Smithsonian using your work? Is that what you mentioned?
Oh, yeah. I got to tell it like this. I got this random email from si.edu, and I was like, who is that? I didn't know whether to open it or, they tell us to be careful. And I opened it up, and I got an email from the Smithsonian, and they said, we came across your quote unquote fantastic map. I don't know how they found it to this day. And they have an exhibit that's going to open December 13th called In the Wake of Slavery. And they're doing what they call object connections. Like they'll show handcuffs and slave shackles, put them together to show. Of course, David, they don't mention the word reparations, but let's stop there. But anyway, they wanted to use my markers for the ships. So they're going to use all 100 of the markers in that exhibit. So I'm really excited about that.
Thanks, Effie.
Thank you.
Dr. Horne, I wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction. I heard you on another podcast, and it sort of relates to what Shelley was saying, is that, a lot of us are only exposed to bourgeois media. And if I listen to bourgeois media, it looks like Israel is just kicking butt. They just have a commanding control over that part of the world. But as I listen to you, I think in one of your comments, you mentioned that, in fact, Israel has retreated from some of the northern borders of Israel because of either Hezbollah or some of the influence in Lebanon. And I wanted to know if you could just sort of talk about your perspectives on what's going on in Gaza, and maybe, I guess, some of the new developments with Iran.
Well, I will certainly do so, but let me say that I'm fading fast, so this may have to be my last comment.
Sure, thank you.
With regard to our session. Well, post October 7th, you see a general abandonment of southern Israel, with the occupants moving northward, with the government having to pick up the tab for their hotel rooms. As you noted, you see a progressive abandonment of northern Israel because of the tens of thousands of missiles that Hezbollah in southern Lebanon are able to train upon Israel. The Israeli army is heavily dependent upon reservists, folks who routinely would be absent war, stocking grocery shelves or sitting in office cubicles, and now they're on the front lines of battle. So Israel is hemorrhaging cash. They had to spend over $1 billion on April 13th to basically deflect the projectiles that Iran had been sending into Israel. And the Zionist billionaires in North America, despite their deep pockets, are not necessarily going to be able to bail out the Israeli economy. In fact, Ronan Bergman, who reports occasionally for the New York Times and is cited in Israel, said that if the Israeli populace were aware of the hysteria in the war cabinet, particularly on April 13th and April 14th, there would be millions seeking to leave the country right now. Which brings me, in terms of alternative sources, you may be familiar with the Electronic Intifada, the Gray Zone with Max Blumenthal, Mondo Weiss. There are many useful sources, alternative sources, that would point to this cul-de-sac that Israel has now entered, and to repeat facing a repetitive cycle of so-called tactical victories accompanied by strategic defeats, leading to the conclusion of the Israeli scholar Ilan Pappé, now at the University of Exeter, who suggests that we may be in the foothills of the beginning of the end of the entire Zionist project. That's his conclusion, not mine. So it's a real crisis. It's going to be a crisis for not only the Israelis, but the Israeli lobby here in North America. But in any case, I'm going to have to sign off. Thank you for your attention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll have you back again.
Thank you so much, Professor Horne. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, thank you for your attention, and send me the link if you can remember.
Yeah, absolutely.